let's welcome Chris Dede. He is the Senior Research Fellow at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and his presentation is about how AI can empower component-based educational research.
So thank you for inviting me to share ideas. I am a co-PI and the co-research lead in the center that Mike Garn mentioned earlier, the National AI Institute on Adult Learning and Online Education. And full disclosure, this talk is about methodology. Now, before you decide it's a good time to have a fresh cup of coffee or maybe to have a cat nap until there's a more interesting speaker, this is a thrilling talk about a really exciting methodology. And in contrast to the other talks that we've heard, this is about something that can affect all of the kinds of innovations that we have discussed thus far and all of the kinds of research that has been reported on thus far. So one of the goals for a long time of work in education research is to identify what works for whom under what conditions. And Barbara Means recently wrote an article in which she talked about the fact that there is a kind of a gap or a chasm in educational research results between research that is too abstract and general to be useful, because it's sort of like mom and apple pie, and research that is specific and concrete and detailed, but very limited in its explanatory value and its generalizability, because it's really just about one particular thing. And as a result of this gap, education research is typically not very useful. Now, Barbara said that what's needed is research in between those two extremes, and she highlighted research by one of our fellow keynoters in this session, Ken Kadinger, and his team as part of the robust learning work within LearnLab, and cited some examples of principles that she felt were what we need to be coming out with from research as a way of bridging the gap between those two extremes. And these concrete examples show the level of generalization and the level of specificity that could span a variety of innovations and a variety of audiences and a variety of settings. So I'm now going to use the slides and reference the work of Dr. Jeannie Century, who is at the University of Chicago and who is a leader in this area called component-based research. In fact, Jeannie and I and Joe Taylor and Barbara Means and Jeremy Rochelle wrote a mid-scale research infrastructure proposal about component-based research that unfortunately was not funded, but we haven't given up our attempt to make this happen. So in a nutshell, the CBR approach does not do what classic education research does, which is to study whole interventions and decide whether the intervention as a whole, on average, across all participants works, or does not work. So it's not the sort of gold standard research that characterizes things like the What Works Clearinghouse. Instead, what CBR does is what Barbara is calling for, which is it dismantles innovations into components and into contexts and participants and outcomes, so that it's always asking what works when, for whom, not for the intervention as a whole, but for the different components that make the intervention work. And one can imagine taking the results of a typical What Works Clearinghouse study that shows no significant effects, which is the average finding from the What Works Clearinghouse, that nothing works, and in fact showing that in that data there is evidence of subgroups that may have been affected quite positively by interventions that also affected other subgroups negatively, so that you got the averaging out approach. So what are the components in component-based research? Well, different groups advocating for this approach and groups in other fields of research, in the sciences in particular, where component-based research is much more widely used, have different definitions for describing what the components are. But I think what Barbara gave as examples is a useful way to think about this. I was recently at a workshop on engineering learning, and I'll talk more about that workshop later, at which Janet Kolodner presented some overarching areas. And she was not talking about component-based research, but when I looked at these lists, I said to myself, well, these are where you could break down these general processes and influences into components. And that would be a useful process to do. Another thing that was shared at the conference was a new book called The Learning Engineering Toolkit. More about that later. And I found on page 244 this table, which looks at an outcome goal and then asks which of the kinds of things that we know from the learning sciences and cognitive science and neuroscience and the social sciences, which of these might be good levers to try to achieve this outcome goal. And again, these are at too high a level to be the components, but subcomponents of these might be a really good fit for what's going on. So the use of components in research is not typically done. Studies are not often described where the components are detailed sufficiently so that one understands what they really were, and they're often not individually linked to user characteristics or outcomes or contextual factors. And one of the reasons, and this is the hardest thing I believe about component-based research, is that we need taxonomies. And the taxonomies need to be able to specify across research teams, across research initiatives, across research projects, when somebody says something, it's the same thing, as opposed to education research, where people have many words for the same thing and the same words for different things. You don't find in anatomy conferences people disagreeing about whether food processing takes place in the brain or the stomach, but you get a lot of this still in the field of education. And taxonomic determinations require the field basically saying, we're going to define some things that are rigorous so that they are components and they can be examined across projects. For example, one of the things that I've done frequently with my team in curricula that we've built is use what's called jigsaw pedagogy, in which different learners have different pieces of the information that they need to succeed. But even that term, which I've listed as relatively specific, needs more taxonomic definition, so that if two groups say they're using jigsaw pedagogy, there's a way to take that component as common across them. So as Jeannie illustrates in these slides, if you look at the problems on the left, which are endemic problems across education research writ large, including, I would add, my own research and research on AI in education, components really are something that would give some traction on these endemic problems. And in fact, in scientific fields that do use components, like plant biology, they have been very successful in helping to disentangle what's really going on. So that's some thoughts on component-based research. Jeannie is here. She's going to join me in the breakout group as co-host. She's going to help answer questions about this idea of component-based research. and I'm grateful to her for making the time to do this. Now, there is a field, unfortunately, called learning engineering, which is confusing, but Herb Simon wasn't really thinking about this when he came up with the idea almost 50 years ago. That's really about engineering learning. I was co-editor of a book on this in 2019. This year, the Learning Engineering Toolkit is sort of a second generation attempt in a book to summarize this. It's tremendous advance over the first book, which I thought was pretty good, but the Learning Engineering Toolkit is really drilling down into it. And this is one of the diagrams from the Learning Engineering Toolkit that emphasizes that the taxonomy is really important on the front end, but the next challenge in component-based research is really the data. That typically, if we study whole interventions, we don't ask the kinds of questions that are going to lead to an understanding of the contribution of the components and which components work for whom under what conditions. So we have to change the kinds of questions that we ask. We have to change the kinds of data and instrumentation that we collect. We have to monitor the implementations to make sure we're getting the data that we need. This is another area in which RCTs typically fall short. They end up with different problems with the data that's collected such that they don't have the statistical power to work. And they need to then iteratively on analysis help us better understand the next time around what kind of data we need and how to do that better. So another thing that is an example of this from the
So Chris, you have to unmute yourself and continue if you can.
Sure.
I think we had to mute everyone, and now, Chris, you're good. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm back again. So we not only need to answer these kinds of questions for data about the whole implementation, but we have to disaggregate the implementation, the innovation into components, and then answer these kinds of questions about each of the components within a taxonomic framework. So this is really a transformative innovation. It's going to require doing things quite differently than we have so far. In terms of applying this, this is from this National AI Institute on Adult Learning and Online Education. A central innovation within this group is AI-powered cognitive assistance for teaching that Ashok Goel has been developing for some time. And the infrastructure that is being built to collect data and to understand it is such that it would be possible to do component-based research and to start developing these taxonomies, at least within this particular domain. So I have talked with this about my methodological colleagues at Harvard, and they basically are uninterested. And what they say over and over and over again is, well, you just can't get enough statistical power to do this. And of course, you can't get enough statistical power if you don't have the taxonomies and you don't have the components defined such that they can be examined across projects and implementations. But what they don't understand is that AI and engineering learning are going to give us the kinds of data sets if we do create the taxonomies and if we do report our implementations in a way that makes that knowledge accessible, that we could in fact have enough statistical power to do all of this. And the very people that are scoffing at this idea today, 10 years ago, they were the visionaries who were saying, you know, if we only had enough data, we could do RCTs. Well, the field keeps moving. Bev asked just quickly at the end of this if I could sketch something about a project that I find of interest. I am within AI Allo, this institute, I am much more interested in performance-based simulations with human coaching and AI coaching than I am in instructional teaching and instructional assistance. So I've modified the AI Allo diagram to show this. And there are systems now like Immersion, which is a digital puppeteering system. Full disclosure, I'm an advisor to Immersion, where a simulation specialist can play up to 5 or 6 virtual people at the same time. And the learner, who might be thousands of miles away, can have an interaction with these virtual people. For example, learning to negotiate by interacting with your superiors in an organization. This is like a flight simulator for human skills. And if you look at the dashboard for Immersion, you see the virtual people that the simulation specialist is creating. This is the simulation specialist dashboard. You see the learner at full bandwidth through the webcam, and then you see the rich kinds of data that are being collected in real time. This is the sort of system, and there are many other examples, from which we could develop components, define them carefully, and collect the kind of cross-project data that would allow us to do component-based research. So going back to where I started, the goal of this isn't component-based research. Component-based research is a means to an end. The end is personalization. That if we are going to get to true personalization, including student choice and voice, we have to know what works when for whom, under what conditions. And I believe this is a very exciting opportunity to do that. So thanks for giving me the chance to share.
Great, thanks very much, Chris. So you didn't mention that as one of your projects, you might want to develop a taxonomy that identifies the component and the participant and who can learn. Do you see that as a possible 3-year project, or it'll only give you one taxonomy for one kind of component, 3 years?
I see sort of a demonstration of concept being possible within 3 years.
Got it.
And a variety of people are already using Immersion, and I'm not pushing Immersion, but it's the system that I know well for different projects. And one could suggest to them components that we see in what they're doing. And if they agree, if they kind of validate that these are the components, then as a demonstration of concept, we could look across the projects, answering those data-based questions for the components and developing a sense of the relative contribution of the component to the outcome, or the relative contribution to subpopulations within the learners.
Yeah, great. Some other people had their hands up. Is someone else want to ask a question for Chris on components or not? Okay. Okay, thanks very much, Chris.